April 15th, 1986. U.S. Air Force Major Brian Shul streaked through the stratosphere, 15 miles over Colonel Gaddafi's Libya in his Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. Flying too high for enemy fighters to reach, too fast for missiles to catch, virtually invisible to radar, not a single one has been shot down in over 2 decades of operation. But a series of course corrections has temporarily slowed Shul's Blackbird's speed. Suddenly, he sees red warning lights flaring across his instrument panel. Somehow, dated Soviet-built Libyan surface-to-air batteries have locked on to the world's fastest aircraft. The SR-71's only hope was to hit the gas. Everyone was about to find out if the Blackbird could actually outrun a missile. The challenge. The development of the SR-71 can be directly linked to an infamous incident involving its predecessor, the Lockheed U-2 spy plane. On May 1, 1960, a U-2 flown by Francis Gary Powers was disabled over Soviet airspace. Hit by surface-to-air missiles, the aircraft plummeted from 70,000 feet to 30,000 feet before Powers could bail out of the damaged cockpit. Powers survived, but was immediately captured by Soviet forces. President Eisenhower's cover story about a weather research aircraft quickly fell apart when the Soviets proudly displayed the downplane surveillance equipment at a press conference. The U-2 incident became an immediate diplomatic catastrophe, straining already tense Cold War relations. Worst of all for Washington was the realization that if the Soviets had shot down one spy plane, they could do it again. The only way to avoid a repeat of this embarrassing situation would be to create a new aircraft that could fly so high and so fast that no existing air defense system could touch it. The aircraft would have a radar profile so small that it would be nearly undetectable to the enemy. Fortunately, Lockheed was already on the case. The company's vice president and head of its Skunk Works advanced development team, the legendary Clarence Kelly Johnson, had been the chief designer of the U-2. Even before the May 1960 incident, he had anticipated that the aircraft's days would be numbered as Soviet air defenses improved. With his uncompromising standards and innovative thinking, Johnson had begun developing concepts for an aircraft that would be virtually undetectable by any radar and untouchable by any missile. Now, under pressure from Washington to offer a solution as quickly as possible, Johnson promised his team would succeed in its toughest assignment yet: to create a new spy plane with a minimal radar cross-section that could fly above 80,000 feet at speeds exceeding Mach 3, and to have it flying in a mere 20 months, a timeline that most aerospace experts considered impossible. The project began under the CIA's tight control as a successor to the U-2, initially designated the A-12. The Skunk Works operated under extraordinary secrecy, with the project site at Burbank concealed behind tall barriers and security tighter than at most nuclear facilities. Johnson's team worked at breakneck speed, and by April 1962, just as he had promised, the first A-12 prototype was ready. Inventing the future. The A-12 prototype that emerged from Skunk Works in 1962 was unlike any aircraft ever built. It was not so much a continuation of the U-2 as an entirely new creation. Johnson would later recall, quote, "Everything had to be invented. Everything." Johnson and his team's design choices reflected their necessity for both unprecedented aerodynamic performance and a vastly reduced radar profile. This would begin with the A-12's sleek, dart-like shape, a radical departure from conventional aircraft of the era. In order to reflect radar energy away from its source, the prototype's vertical stabilizers were canted inward. The fuselage sides were flattened with tapering edges, while sawtooth-shaped sections incorporated special radar-absorbing materials, an early attempt at what would later be called stealth technology. The A-12 featured tapered chines, sharp edges that ran along either side of the fuselage from the nose to the wing roots. These chines represented a breakthrough in integrated design, serving 3 crucial functions simultaneously. They generated vortices that improved stability at high speeds. They provided additional lift to the airframe, and they scattered incoming radar signals away from their source. However, the extreme speeds at which the A-12 was expected to travel presented another fundamental challenge: heat. With temperatures on the aircraft's leading edges expected to exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit during flight at Mach 3 and beyond, conventional aluminum airframes would simply melt. This challenge forced Johnson's team to use titanium alloy for 85% of the structure, a material that provided the strength of stainless steel at a fraction of the weight, while withstanding the intense heat of supersonic flight. Titanium proved exceptionally difficult to work with. The brittle alloy would shatter if mishandled, causing immense frustration on the assembly line. Conventional cadmium-plated steel tools fractured the titanium on contact, forcing skunkworks to design and fabricate new tools, themselves made of titanium. Adding to these complications, metallurgical contamination was a persistent problem. At one point, 80% of the delivered titanium was rejected on these grounds. To handle the massive temperature variations, the A-12 skin panels were manufactured to fit loosely on the ground, only achieving proper alignment as the airframe heated up during flight. Nevertheless, this design feature, along with the lack of a proper fuel sealing system, meant the aircraft leaked fuel while stationary, a characteristic that would become legendary among ground crews. Meanwhile, the canopy of the single-seat cockpit was equipped with special quartz glass to withstand extreme temperatures, with the outer windscreen made of 3 layers and cooling sections between them. For propulsion, the A-12 was designed around the revolutionary Pratt & Whitney J-58 engine, though initial flight testing began with the less powerful J-75 due to J-58 development delays. Each engine could produce 25,000 pounds of thrust with afterburners engaged, allowing the aircraft to reach speeds over 2,000 miles per hour. The engines functioned as traditional jet engines during takeoff and transitioned to supersonic speeds, before essentially becoming specialized ramjets at high Mach numbers. These engines would require equally sophisticated inlet systems to efficiently process the enormous volumes of air needed at Mach 3. The prototype featured a complex system of movable cones and bypass doors that would automatically adjust to maintain optimal airflow at various speeds. Due to the extreme operating conditions, the engines would also need specialized fuel. Conventional jet fuel would have been far too volatile at the temperatures the A-12 experienced during flight. Engineers developed JP-7, a unique high flashpoint fuel specifically designed for the aircraft. Pilot Colonel Rich Graham later explained its unusual properties, saying, quote, "I've already seen a crew chief throw a match, a cigarette butt, into this JP-7, and it just extinguishes." This high flashpoint created another challenge. Standard ignition systems couldn't light the fuel. The solution was triethylborane, or TEB, a chemical so volatile it ignites spontaneously when exposed to air. Graham described it vividly, quote, "Each engine has a 1¼ pint. If I had it in a squirt gun and I squirted it into the atmosphere, it goes kaboom. It explodes with contact with the atmosphere." Each engine carried just enough TEB for 16 starts, with a precisely metered amount injected to initiate combustion each time the engines needed to be started or the afterburners engaged. Pilots could actually see when TEB was ejected, as it produced a distinctive green flash visible in the exhaust. To the test. The A-12 prototype was ready, but the US government was keen to keep the project secret for as long as possible. Therefore, trials would take place at the same remote testing location deep in the Nevada desert where the U-2 had been tested. Officially called Groom Lake, this highly classified facility would soon become the stuff of legend as the semi-mythical Area 51, its existence not publicly acknowledged by the CIA until 2013. It was here where, on April 30th, piloted by Lockheed test pilot Louis Schulk, the A-12 prototype took to the skies for the first time. Still in its natural titanium finish, rather than the black paint that would later become iconic, this first flight was kept brief and below the aircraft's potential. Schulk kept the landing gear down throughout the flight as a precaution, reaching just 340 miles per hour and 30,000 feet during this initial 35-minute test. While modest compared to what would come, this first flight was crucial in validating the basic handling characteristics of a design unlike anything that had flown before. Over the following months, as testing progressed, the A-12 gradually pushed toward its design capabilities. On July 20th, 1963, the A-12 achieved a sustained speed above Mach 3 at an astounding altitude of 78,000 feet, breaking records nearly every time it flew. The aircraft's outstanding radar deflection capabilities were also confirmed during testing, with radar cross-section measurements showing an incredible 90% reduction compared to conventional aircraft of similar size. These tests revealed practical challenges as well. At such extreme speeds, traditional navigation methods became obsolete. Visual references that pilots had relied on for decades, highways, rivers, and metropolitan areas, were rendered meaningless, replaced by mountain ranges, coastlines, and large bodies of water as the only features that could be distinguished at Mach 3. After completing its testing phase at Groom Lake, the A-12 moved from experimental aircraft to operational spy plane. In 1965, with the Vietnam War escalating, the CIA began deploying A-12s to Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, Japan, under an operation codenamed Black Shield. The aircraft would conduct missions over North Vietnam, North Korea, and other critical areas in Asia, providing the United States with vital intelligence that satellites of the era simply couldn't match. A-12 operational missions were conducted in absolute secrecy. The aircraft flew so high and so fast that even when detected on radar, they would be gone before fighter aircraft could be scrambled or surface-to-air missiles could reach their altitude. The pilots, rather than being military officers, were civilian CIA employees operating under non-official cover. If captured, they would have no military protection under international conventions. From A-12 to SR-71. However, while the A-12 carried out its CIA operations, the U.S. Air Force was busy developing its own version of the aircraft. The Air Force had first ordered its own variant, initially designated the R-12 by Lockheed as early as December 1962. Their version would be longer and heavier than the original A-12, primarily to accommodate more fuel and a two-person crew. Unlike the single-seat A-12, the Air Force wanted their aircraft to have tandem cockpits, one for the pilot and the second for a reconnaissance systems officer, or RSO, who would navigate and operate the sophisticated surveillance systems. The RSO's expertise would be crucial for managing the complex electronic and photographic equipment during marathon reconnaissance missions. The Air Force variant also featured reshaped fuselage chines and redesigned engine nacelles. While the A-12 had been primarily designed to carry a high-resolution camera, the new aircraft would carry a more diverse payload, including signals intelligence sensors, side-looking airborne radar, and multiple photographic systems. By 1964, with Cold War tensions high and a presidential election approaching, politics entered the picture. Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater had been criticizing President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration for falling behind the Soviet Union in developing new weapons. Seeking to counter this criticism, Johnson made a surprising decision to reveal the existence of the top-secret aircraft program. In July 1964, in what would become a famous announcement, President Johnson publicly disclosed the existence of this new reconnaissance aircraft, referring to it as the RS-71. However, Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay had lobbied for the SR designation for strategic reconnaissance instead of RS for reconnaissance strike. Either before or after the speech, sources differ, the designation was changed to SR-71, though the president's actual words remained RS-71 in his delivery. That same year, the aircraft received its distinctive black paint, a practical decision rather than an aesthetic one. Engineers had realized that black paint both absorbs and emits heat efficiently, helping to dissipate the extreme temperatures generated during high-speed flight across the entire airframe. This functional black finish gave rise to the name that would captivate the public imagination: Blackbird. The Blackbird takes flight. On December 22, 1964, the first SR-71 performed its maiden flight from Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California, with Lockheed test pilot Bob Gilliland at the controls. Just over a year later, in January 1966, the first SR-71s entered service with the 4200 Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base in California. This unit would later be redesignated as the 9th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing. While the CIA's A-12 had operated in complete secrecy, the SR-71 would fly overt missions with USAF markings. A-12 pilots had operated as civilian CIA employees, but SR-71 pilots were uniformed Air Force officers who carried Geneva Convention's ID cards in case they were shot down. On March 21, 1968, Majors Jerome O'Malley and Edward Payne flew the first operational SR-71 sortie from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, gathering intelligence over North Vietnam. As the A-12 program wound down that same year, the SR-71 took over the vital reconnaissance role in Southeast Asia, quickly proving its value by providing detailed intelligence about strategic hotspots throughout the region. The local personnel at Kadena nicknamed the sinister-looking SR-71 Habu after a venomous pit viper native to the region. The name stuck, becoming one of several affectionate nicknames for the Blackbird among those who worked with it. Flying at over 80,000 feet, more than 15 miles above the Earth, the SR-71 could survey 100,000 square miles of territory in a single hour. Its sophisticated camera systems could resolve objects as small as 6 inches from its cruising altitude, while its side-looking airborne radar could penetrate cloud cover to map terrain and track vehicle movements. Yet, this extraordinary reconnaissance capability would have been worthless if the aircraft couldn't survive to bring its intelligence home. When surface-to-air missile launches were detected, the standard Blackbird evasive action was remarkably straightforward. Simply accelerate and outpace the threat. This strategy proved remarkably effective. Over 4,000 missiles were fired at SR-71s during their operational career, yet none ever managed to score a hit. The few losses the program did experience came from mechanical failures rather than enemy action. Flying the Blackbird was an experience unlike any other in aviation. In preparation for each mission, pilots and RSOs followed a specific dietary protocol that included a high-protein, low-residue meal of steak and eggs. After their meal, crews would undergo a quick medical examination before donning their specialized pressure suits, effectively the same type used by astronauts. These suits were essential. At operating altitudes, blood would boil without pressurization, and if ejection became necessary at Mach 3, pilots would face temperatures up to 450 degrees Fahrenheit from air friction alone. For those fortunate enough to fly it, the SR-71 offered an experience that transcended ordinary aviation. Air Force Colonel Jim Watkins expressed the almost transcendent quality of Blackbird missions. Quote, "At 85,000 feet and Mach 3, it was almost a religious experience. Nothing had prepared me to fly that fast. My God, even now, I get goosebumps remembering." The view from the cockpit was equally extraordinary. Flying at the edge of space, pilots could see the curvature of the Earth while looking up into a sky that appeared almost black. Below them, the world passed by at a rate of nearly a mile every second, rendering conventional navigation references useless. The aircraft offered a perspective of our planet that until that time had been available only to a handful of astronauts. Yet, while the cockpit came with an incredible view, it was also a somewhat extreme environment. During Mach 3 flight, the exterior of the windscreen could reach temperatures of 600 degrees Fahrenheit, while the interior maintained a more modest 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Still hot enough that crews found innovative uses for it. Colonel Graham recalled, quote, "If I took that tube food and jammed it against my window in the front windscreen, which at the outside is 622 degrees Fahrenheit at Mach 3.2, and if I gave it about a minute and a half on both sides and squeezed the tube to normalize the temperature, it went down a lot better warm than it did cold. You improvise up there, and that was my in-flight oven." Missions typically lasted between 3 and 4 hours, though some stretched to 8 or more. The SR-71's most notable missions came during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when it flew from the east coast of the United States to the Middle East and back, providing crucial intelligence directly to President Nixon. Graham explained, quote, "The president wanted to find out whether the Arabs and the Israelis had really moved back from the front line like they said they did. We went over there, took the imagery, came back, and showed photographic proof they were both lying about where their forces were. He called both countries and said, 'Get them back. I've got proof you're not where you're supposed to be.' That's what ended the Yom Kippur War." During operations in Northern Europe, on rare occasions with exceptional visibility, Blackbird crews could spot Soviet interceptors trailing far below them, sometimes up to 200 miles away, futilely attempting to intercept the much faster reconnaissance aircraft. Despite the best efforts of Soviet pilots flying the MiG-25 Foxbat, the fastest interceptor in their arsenal, the SR-71 always remained untouchable, slipping away at speeds no other aircraft could match. The SR-71's operational tempo was limited by its intensive maintenance requirements. On average, each aircraft could fly only once per week due to the lengthy preparations needed. Very often, an SR-71 would return with rivets missing, delaminated panels, or damaged inlets, requiring repair or replacement. In some cases, the aircraft wouldn't be ready to fly again for a month. Despite these challenges, the intelligence gathered by the Blackbird proved worth every hour of maintenance and every drop of the specialized JP-7 fuel that leaked from its tanks. The SR-71 provided American leaders with crucial information that simply couldn't be obtained any other way, helping to navigate the Cold War's dangerous waters while remaining above the fray. Becoming legend. The SR-71's extraordinary capabilities were officially recognized on September 1, 1974, when it claimed the record for speed over a recognized course by flying from New York to London in just 1 hour, 54 minutes, 56.4 seconds. This flight, piloted by USAF Major James Sullivan with Noel Whitfield as Reconnaissance Systems Officer, maintained an average speed of approximately Mach 2.72, including slowing down for mid-air refueling. For comparison, the fastest commercial Concorde flight between those cities took nearly 3 hours, while a typical airliner flight lasted more than 6 hours. The Blackbird continued to break records throughout the 1970s. On July 28, 1976, 2 more world records were set that remain unbeaten to this day. Piloted by Captain Robert Helt, SR-71 serial number 617962 reached an absolute altitude record for sustained horizontal flight of 85,069 feet. That same day, another SR-71 set an absolute speed record of 2,193.2 miles per hour, equivalent to around Mach 3.3. Nevertheless, perhaps the Blackbird's finest hour would come on April 15, 1986. Following American airstrikes on Tripoli in response to Libyan support for terrorism, Major Brian Shul and his RSO, Walter Watson, were tasked with post-strike reconnaissance. As they raced their SR-71 across the hostile territory, Libyan air defenses activated. Multiple surface-to-air missile sites began tracking the Blackbird. Warning lights illuminated in the cockpit as radar lock-ons were detected. Faced with missiles climbing toward their aircraft, Shul pushed the throttles forward beyond their usual operational settings. The Blackbird responded immediately, accelerating well beyond its official maximum speed. Shul would later recall, quote, "The plane was flying faster than any of us had ever seen. We weren't really sure exactly how fast we were going because the instruments only displayed up to Mach 3.5. The missiles fell away behind them as the Blackbird escaped the threat through sheer velocity, proving once again that the SR-71's primary defense was simply to accelerate beyond the reach of whatever was trying to catch it. Shul and Watson returned safely with their valuable intelligence, having demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion possible why no Blackbird was ever lost to enemy fire. This incredible feat to outperform even its official specifications when pushed to its limits. The following year, on June 29, 1987, another SR-71 mission would demonstrate both the aircraft's vulnerability and its international significance. During a routine Baltic Express mission, a carefully planned flight path through the narrow corridor of international airspace between Sweden and the Soviet bloc, an SR-71 suffered a serious engine explosion while cruising at around 65,000 feet. The crippled aircraft violated Swedish airspace as the pilot struggled to maintain control. Unarmed Swedish Saab 37 Viggen fighters were scrambled to investigate, and recognizing the Blackbird was in distress, escorted it safely toward Danish airspace. What remained classified for over 30 years was that multiple Soviet MiG-25s had been launched, with orders to shoot down the damaged SR-71. NSA data later revealed that a MiG-25 had actually locked a missile onto the struggling Blackbird, but the presence of the Swedish escort fighters may have prevented the Soviets from firing. In 2018, the 4 Swedish pilots involved were awarded medals from the USAF for their actions, a remarkable footnote to Cold War history that remained secret for decades. Last hurrah. Despite its unmatched capabilities, the SR-71 program faced increasing scrutiny as the 1980s progressed. The aircraft was expensive to operate, with estimates ranging from $85,000 to $200,000 per flight hour. Maintenance demands remained high, and the specialized JP-7 fuel required its own dedicated tanker aircraft, the KC-135Q, for mid-air refueling. Critics argued that satellite reconnaissance was making the Blackbird obsolete. Supporters countered that satellites followed predictable orbits, allowing adversaries to hide assets during overflights, while the SR-71 could arrive unpredictably and deliver imagery within hours instead of days. The The debate ended in 1989 when, largely for political and budgetary reasons rather than operational ones, the Air Force retired the SR-71 fleet. However, before consigning the Blackbird to history, the Air Force decided to have it make one final record-breaking journey. On March 6, 1990, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yielding and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph J.T. Bida took to the skies in SR-71 serial number 617972 for what would be the aircraft's final operational flight in Air Force service. Their mission: to fly coast to coast across the United States, from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., and then deliver the aircraft to its final home at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. What followed was an astonishing display of the Blackbird's capabilities. The SR-71 traversed the 2,404-mile journey between the east and west coasts in just 67 minutes 54 seconds, achieving an average speed of 2,124 miles per hour over Mach 2.7. During the flight, the crew set 4 new speed records: Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in 64 minutes 20 seconds, West Coast to East Coast in 67 minutes 54 seconds, Kansas City to Washington, D.C. in just under 26 minutes, and St. Louis to Cincinnati in 8 minutes 32 seconds. The National Aeronautic Association accepted all 4 records, while Air and Space magazine reported that the aircraft had reached a top speed of 2,242 miles per hour, over Mach 2.9 at one point during its journey. After landing, this remarkable aircraft that had served its country for decades taxied to a stop before a waiting crowd of dignitaries and aviation enthusiasts. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on elected officials. 2 days after the flight, Senator John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, addressed the United States Senate with a pointed rebuke of the decision to retire the aircraft. Quote, "Mr. President, the termination of the SR-71 was a grave mistake and could place our nation at a serious disadvantage in the event of a future crisis. Yesterday's historic transcontinental flight was a sad memorial to our short-sighted policy in strategic aerial reconnaissance." Recognizing this capability gap, Congress voted in 1994 to allocate $100 million to reactivate 3 SR-71s. The aircraft returned to limited service in 1995, flying operational missions until 1998, when final retirement came. Even then, the Blackbird wasn't completely grounded. NASA continued to operate 2 airframes until 1999, using them as high-speed, high-altitude research platforms. Glenn's words would prove prescient. The decision proved controversial among military leaders, particularly when just months later, during Operation Desert Storm, General Norman Schwarzkopf requested SR-71 reconnaissance that was no longer available. On October 9, 1999, at an air show at Edwards Air Force Base, the SR-71 made its final flight. Piloted by NASA crew members Roger Smith and Robert Meyer, the aircraft reached Mach 3.21, equivalent to 2,463 miles per hour, and an altitude of 80,100 feet, more than twice the height at which commercial airliners typically cruise. After reaching these impressive figures, the Blackbird returned for 3 flybys at the crowd. The elegance of its design moved some onlookers to tears as they witnessed the end of an era. The following day was to have featured the true final flight, with a crew including Marta Bowen-Meyer, who had made history as the first female SR-71 crew member. However, a fuel leak prevented this flight, making October 9th the Blackbird's final journey into the stratosphere. In its 34-year career, from first flight to retirement, the SR-71 had set speed and altitude records that remain unbroken, gathered intelligence that shaped Cold War decision-making, and captured the imagination of aviation enthusiasts worldwide. Even after its retirement, no aircraft has managed to combine the Blackbird's speed, altitude, range, and sensor capabilities, making it quite literally the high point of manned reconnaissance aviation.